I'll be very brief in my remarks because I know what you're really here to hear is Tom Frazier. But since you were so close to our headquarters here just around the corner, I couldn't resist the opportunity to just come say hi and to let you know how grateful we are for all the ways that you support us, whether you're an advocacy ambassador, whether you're part of our WALK family, whether you're brand new to us. Please know that Autism Speaks is here for you to help you as a person with autism or those who care for someone through this journey, and with personalized tools and information. And you may have heard that Autism Speaks had changed our mission to reflect really changes in the community over the last 13 years. And some of those things are a direct reflection of what we heard from people like you. So for example, the importance of programming across the spectrum and throughout the lifespan, that no matter where you are in this journey, Autism Speaks should be home for you. The other is really continuing our mission in research, which Tom will talk to you about, really focusing on causes and better treatments for people with autism and lots of different kinds of modalities, both quality of life things today as well as things for the future. And the other real pivot for Autism Speaks recently has been, I think we're all known for building awareness over the time, but really moving beyond just awareness into understanding and acceptance of people with autism. That it's our job to shine that, use that bright blue light to create a more welcoming community and communities, not just in the United States, but around the globe. And we do all this with your support and advocacy and Facebook following and all the great things you do to get involved. So I hope that tonight you'll get to hear a deep dive into one of our 5 mission pillars, research, but know, and Tom will make this point too, that research is really a part of everything we do, whether it is that increasing understanding, acceptance, that first mission pillar, whether it is accelerating life-enhancing, being a catalyst for life-enhancing research breakthroughs, whether it's making sure we continue our groundbreaking work in early diagnosis and access to timely intervention really quickly, because we know that makes such a lifetime of difference, can for so many people. Whether it's our newer focus on transition to successful adult outcomes, we know that that's a growing need in this community. We're working hard to do that. And then finally, providing information, access to information and referrals, again, across the lifespan and throughout the spectrum. So those are the 5 things that Autism Speaks does every day and will continue to do with your help. So with no further ado, it's my true pleasure to introduce Tom Frazier. He is our Chief Science Officer. He comes to us from the Cleveland Clinic, where not only is he a clinical psychologist, but actually ran behavioral programs. So he knows this world inside and out and has just added so much to Autism Speaks, and he's such a great advocate for the entire autism community. So, Tom?
Thank you. First of all, thanks for coming. I've done a number of these around the country, and I have to tell you that you are by far the most punctual crowd that I have had at any of the sites, and it's not even close. So thank you for coming and being here. And I hope that over the next, say, 40 minutes or so, I can give you a little bit of the landscape of autism research through the lens of what Autism Speaks has supported. And in doing that, obviously, I'm really hoping to just whet your appetite, because in having been a part of a number of these events, I know that one of the most fun parts of the event is actually question and answer at the end. And I will tell you that I can't answer every question, but I'll take any question that you have. Now, so, as Angela mentioned, science is only one of the mission delivery areas. And in fact, if we're doing our job in science, then what we're doing is we're feeding information to the other 2 main mission delivery areas, which is our family services and our advocacy group. And it's really together, working together as a bigger group, that we can achieve everything that we need for individuals and families in the autism community. So before I even launch into science, I just want to point out and just highlight a couple of things. This is by no means a full survey of what we've done in advocacy or family services. It's just a taste. But I want to point out to you that our advocacy group works tirelessly to be able to help at the federal, state, and local levels make sure that people with autism and families, autism families, actually have the resources, supports, laws, regulations that they need in order to be successful. And This slide is just demonstrating that we've been able to achieve 48 of the 50 states passing insurance reform. And of course, this is a large number of covered lives. I think it's over 110 million covered lives now for autism. And this is really just an example, a taste of how we can get the right things in place so that people have better access to services and supports. The other taste I want to give you on the services side is something that I think we're all at Autism Speaks very proud of, which is our autism response team. In fact, we have the director of our autism response team here, Lindsay Nader. And what I love about the autism response team is that if you're ever on the phone, and I'm on the phone a lot, you almost never talk to an actual live human being anymore. So it's really cool to have a group of people that are dedicated to talking to individuals and families about services and supports. And as the slide shows, they've responded to more than 300,000 calls and emails. I'm sure these numbers are actually low at this point, Lindsay. But and so 888 Autism 2 is something that you can tell folks that are looking for services and supports. So, on the science side, I'm going to walk you through just 3 different sections. The first section is just to give you a history of what's happened in autism science that Autism Speaks has supported. The second thing I want to do is give you an overview of our current programs, what we're supporting now, and why we're doing that, because we think it can make a difference in the future. And then I'm going to wrap up really quickly at the end and just talk about what we've decided to do in our strategic plan starting in 2018, this year, and then through 2020. If you have clarifying questions, it's perfectly fine to ask, but if you have like a more substantive question, I'm going to ask you to just hold it to the end, and we'll go over it at that point. So a very legitimate question to ask, and a question that I've gotten many times before from folks, is what has Autism Speaks Science actually accomplished so far? And the answer is a lot, and I'm not going to spend all night telling you about that. I just want to emphasize 5 areas, okay? So if you leave tonight and you only remember one thing that I talked about or one slide, please let it be this slide, okay? These are the 5 areas. Earlier diagnosis. So Autism Speaks funded research, including funding something called the Baby Siblings Research Consortium, the BSRC, that allowed researchers to identify the early signs and symptoms of autism. And of course, that's crucial for early diagnosis. It only matters if you're identifying early signs and symptoms of autism if there's something you can do to improve the life course and the trajectory for people with autism. And so early intervention, timely intervention is crucial as well. And again, Autism Speaks has done 2 things in this area to try to drive the field forward. One is funding the Toddler Treatment Network, which was a network of sites that got together to really try to understand how can we best provide the earliest developmental and behavioral interventions for people with autism. Then the other thing that they've done is supported individual research. And some of that research has been on things like intensive early developmental and behaviorally based interventions, like the Early Start Denver model, which the study that Autism Speaks supported and that line of research that was supported was able to demonstrate that if you do intensive early developmental behavioral intervention, that you can dramatically improve some of the outcomes, including cognitive outcomes and functional outcomes, and you can also decrease the symptom burden that individuals experience. The second area that we funded through grants is to be able to demonstrate that if you give parents even a low dose of training in how to promote optimal development in their child, even a fairly low dose, that the kids whose parents get that intervention, get that training, do better. And not only do they do better right after the training, they do better 3 years after the training. So there was a study published by Jonathan Green from the UK in 2017 showing that a fairly low dose of parent-mediated intervention can actually result 3 years later in clearly improved trajectories of individuals with autism. The third thing I want you to remember that's been supported is the identification and treatment algorithms for co-occurring medical and mental health conditions. Now, I probably don't even need to tell this audience this, but a large percentage of individuals with autism have co-occurring medical or mental health conditions. ADHD, anxiety, sleep difficulties, mood difficulties, seizures, GI problems, right? these all occur at an increased rate in autism relative to individuals without autism. Okay? They also cause tremendous functional burden for individuals with autism. And so our Autism Treatment Network, which I'll talk more about later because we continue to fund this network, has been very focused on how do we do the best job we can of identifying these early, making physicians more aware of these problems, and helping individuals to get appropriate intervention and treatment. The fourth area is improving a basic understanding of autism. What I mean by that is, anybody here who received an autism diagnosis, say, more than 10 years ago? Or has a loved one who received a diagnosis more than 10 years ago? So I see a number of hands, right? For those of you that raise your hand, this will probably resonate with you. More than 10 years ago, when people were diagnosed, it was very, very common for a physician not to know much about autism, especially if they weren't already in the area, right? So if you went to see a neurologist or a GI doctor or somebody like that, oftentimes they didn't know a lot about autism, right? The other thing that was very common at that point is just the general public didn't know a lot about autism because there was still a lot of research that needed to be done. So Autism Speaks has supported research really all the way from genetics and early biological research, all the way up through understanding brain systems and how the brain functions differently in autism, and all the way up through behavior as well. And so just promoting that basic understanding of autism has been really important. And then the fifth area that I want you to remember is any area of science is only as healthy and effective as the early career researchers, the energetic, vibrant, oftentimes young folks who are learning new methods, innovative methods that are coming into that field. And so Autism Speaks 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, made an investment in fellowships, pre- and postdoctoral fellowships. And we've now funded over 100 pre- and postdoctoral fellowships in autism. And these are the next generation of autism researchers. So I wanted to add a few more things to just highlight before we get into our current programs. This one is a very unfortunate slide, but it is the truth, and that is that unfortunately people with autism tend not to live as long. They have an increased early mortality rate relative to the general population. Why is this? It's not because of autism per se. It's oftentimes because of the things that go along with autism, right? So for example, people with autism have increased rates of accidents, including drowning. Actually, this past summer, there were 2 twins in the New York City area that drowned that had autism. Other accidents, traffic accidents, seizures. Seizures are dangerous. People die from seizures. It's for these reasons that the mortality in autism is increased, early mortality. And it highlights the fact that, especially at Autism Speaks, one of the roles of our science program is not just to point this out, but actually to use this as advocacy so that we can get more dollars into science, so we can better understand autism, and so that we can develop things that hopefully mitigate against some of this early mortality. We've also funded studies about prevalence, and of course everybody hears about prevalence at least once a year during Autism Awareness Month. You hear about the CDC's numbers or about prevalence or about autism in general. One of the points I want to make is that Autism Speaks funded direct prevalence study in South Korea in this case. And why this is so important is because the CDC does a great job every 2 years of providing numbers about autism prevalence. Does anybody know what the most recent numbers are? You can yell out. 1 in 59 is the number. And it was an increase in the prevalence from the last survey. And what's important and what I want you to know is that the CDC does a fantastic job of this, but also they're an indirect prevalence study. So their estimates, almost by definition, are probably a slight underestimate of the actual prevalence, right? And in fact, when you go out and do a direct prevalence study, you tend to find even higher numbers, 1 in 38 in this case. We also have done research to show that autism is associated with financial costs. And in fact, the financial costs of autism in an individual that does not have intellectual disability across the lifetime is about $1.3 million over and above individuals without autism. And if if the individual with autism does have intellectual disability, it's more like $2.3, $2.4 million. And then the annual cost to society is even larger than the number on this screen. We've also focused on trying to understand environmental risk factors, and this is something that I think a lot of us think about, is are there things that are changing in the environment? Are there environmental things that might be altering risk for autism? This slide is just a representation of a meta-analysis. Does anybody know what a meta-analysis is? It's where you take individual studies and put them together in a single analysis. This is actually a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. Only a scientist would do something like that. Where they were trying to put together studies that had already put together studies so that they could come to the firmest conclusion possible about which risk factors we can actually have some confidence in. And you can see here things like fetal distress at birth, birth complications. The longer we wait to have kids, fathers and mothers' age is a risk factor. Family history of autoimmune disease, pregnancy complications, diabetes, maternal diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some established environmental risk factors for autism. And it's good for us to be aware of this, but I also just want to point out that there's a lot more work to be done on environmental risk factors in terms of understanding exactly why do these factors lead to an increased likelihood of autism. And then Autism Speaks helped to fund some research that identified a factor that actually decreases the likelihood of someone having autism. This is a study on folic acid. And so if moms take folic acid immediately before the conception and early in pregnancy, it actually decreases the likelihood that the child will have autism. So that first section was really just intended to give you a flavor of what we've supported, what we've done, what we kind of know. It's not intended to be comprehensive, but just wanted to give you a flavor of that. What I'd like to do now is shift gears into what our current programs are. But in order to do that, I do need to give you a little bit more history. So in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the first twin studies of autism came out. And what they identified was that identical twins if one twin has autism, the other twin will have autism 80% of the time or more. And identical twins, of course, share all of their DNA. Right? Fraternal twins, the number is much lower. It's more like 20 to 30%. Okay? So if one twin has autism, the other twin will have autism 20 to 30% of the time. That observation told us that there was a strong genetic component to autism. Okay? The AGREE program started by a predecessor organization called Cure Autism Now, which became part of Autism Speaks. And the AGREE program stands for Autism Genetic Resource Exchange. It was a really great idea because what they did was they collect biological samples from more than 2,000 families, most of whom had 2 or more children with autism. Okay? And why this is so important is because having these biological samples has allowed researchers to begin to look at the biology of autism and to understand the genetic component of autism. And because of the AGREE resource, and because of the availability of genetic sequencing, we started the Missing Project in 2013. Now, before I get to that, I want to mention something. For those of you that follow any science news, something really, really important in human history happened in 2003. Does anybody know what it is? Kind of giving you a hint. The human genome was sequenced. Yes, so we have the human genome was sequenced, right? And does anybody have any idea how much it cost? What did you say? It's okay, you don't have to. Bam, right on the head. So somewhere between $600 million and $1.2 billion, someone said $1 billion, for one human genome, 2003. By 2013, the cost was roughly $2,000 per genome, okay, just to do the sequencing. And now it's about $1,100 US, and it's probably going to go down even more this year. Okay. It became possible in 2013 to do this at scale. And the idea was we want to understand more about the genetics of autism because we know from other conditions that understanding genes leads you to biology. It helps you to understand biology. And if there's one thing we know about autism right now is that every version of autism is different, right? You've ever heard the saying, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism? Well, it's true. And It also means that autism is a very genetically as well as behaviorally complicated condition. And so it's worth trying to understand the complexity here. Because if we understand the complexity, the biological complexity, we can start to understand what are the individualized treatments and interventions and supports that we want to give people. So MISSING is our whole genome sequencing project. The reason the eyes are missing and missing is just because we're trying to represent that we don't know everything we could know. There's some missing information about autism that we'd like to uncover and understand. Okay? So the MISSING resource is a whole genome sequencing resource. It was based upon our AGREE program samples, and now we've brought in other individuals, families actually, to be part of the resource. The other really smart thing that people did, I wish I could take credit for it, but it was before my time, is they made it an open science project. And open science means that from the outset, MISSING was intended to bring in the smartest people around the world to work on this data, to be able to help us to uncover some of the biology of autism. And so right now, today, we have more than 7,200 whole genome sequences on the Google Cloud. We have 140 researchers around the world, actually from more than 8, I think it's now 9 or 10 countries, that have access to the data. And this has resulted already in some really interesting findings that are leading us in some important directions about autism. One of the most, and I'm not going to go through all of the findings, but one of the findings is that the MISSING project has helped to uncover 62 autism-associated genes, 18 of which had not really been significantly associated before. And those 62 genes probably represent maybe a fifth to a tenth of what we expect to be the total number of genes. In fact, the estimates of the total number of autism-associated genes is between 200 and 1,000. Okay? But we're on the right track, right? 62 is helping us to understand. Now, originally, some of us were concerned in science because we thought, well, if there's 1,000 genes, are we going to need 1,000 different interventions and supports and strategies to help people with autism? Well, what MISSING found is really interesting, I think. Many of these genes cluster into specific biological processes. And because of that clustering, and because those biological processes, some of them are fairly well understood, and we're starting to understand other ones better, we think that we might be able to come up with a smaller number of interventions, supports, or even medicines that could help people with autism. And of the 62 genes that were identified, more than half of them already had medicines that actually target the pathways that those genes participate in. The other thing we did with MISSING is we said from the outset, we want to be able to give people with autism and families with autism as much information as possible. So we want to build a resource for these folks. And so we're in the process of building a portal that will allow families to get much more personalized information, including genetic information if it's available for them, but other kinds of information like the co-occurring conditions so that people can connect with one another. They can get very personalized information about their situation. And this is something that we're working on currently. Hopefully by somewhere in 2019 we'll have a prototype or an initial rollout of this. But it's a really exciting idea because every person with autism is different. And so we're going to need to have this personalization for people so that they can identify things that are relevant to them. Now, I mentioned to you that genes lead us to biology, right? But that still means that you have to do the hard work of understanding that biology. And in fact, part of the work that you have to do is once you get a little bit of a handle on that biology, you want to start to look for medicines or other interventions that can make a difference. And so one of the investments we made at Autism Speaks is our PACT program. PACT is kind of a mouthful. It stands for Preclinical Autism Consortium for Therapeutics. But that's a long way of saying what we were trying to do here is build models, in this case mouse models, of autism, specific genetic forms of autism, that we would then be able to study and in fact be able to use to look for medicines that might be helpful. And one of the other ideas behind PACT is if we have this resource available to researchers, people will want to use it. And in fact, pharmaceutical and biotech companies might want to use it. And we've already had biotech companies interested in using the resource and using the resource. And one of the values in this is, regardless of what you think of pharmaceutical or biotech companies, they have lots of money, they have lots of access to interventions, medicines, and the more we can get them involved in autism, the more chance it is they'll find something that's useful. And so the idea is we want to bring them back involved so that they might be able to find something useful to help people with autism. Then once you have some promising medicines, you still have to test those medicines in people, right? You have to test their safety, you have to make sure that they're tolerable, and also that they are effective, that they work. And so you need to be able to have networks that can do these kinds of clinical trials, right? Because as we look at individuals with autism, and we're going to find more and more specific forms of autism, you may have, even in a place like New York City, you may have only 10 people or 12 people with a particular form of autism in that place. So you're going to need these distributed networks that can do this kind of work. Well, luckily at Autism Speaks, we've already made an investment in a network. It's called the Autism Treatment Network. And to date, what the Autism Treatment Network has focused on is understanding these co-occurring medical and mental health conditions and developing best practice, gold standard quality care for people with autism. It's a collaborative network. It's 12 sites in the US and Canada. And it's also a platform for research. And I'm not going to go through all this slide and tell you everything about the Autism Treatment Network has done. It would take a long time. They have more than 110 peer-reviewed publications over the last decade. But a couple things that they've done. They've published treatment guidelines so that physicians, pediatricians who read pediatrics, because that's their journal, actually can learn more about autism. They've published now, they're about to publish a clinical care manual that will allow any specialty center around the country to adopt these best practices as part of their center. And they've published all kinds of healthcare toolkits that are freely available to be downloaded from the Autism Speaks websites. I want to mention another thing. Who here has ever walked or raised money or attended an event for Autism Speaks? Just raise your hand if you have. Walked or raised money or done anything with Autism Speaks? Yeah. So a lot of hands. And even if you haven't, that's fine. I just want to point out that one of the things we try to do is we try to leverage every dollar raised in science. And this is really important. Because we funded the Autism Treatment Network, HRSA, the Human Resource Service Administration of the government, wanted to get involved in autism. They wanted to help with physical health. Because the Autism Treatment Network already existed, HRSA made an investment. And they had made an investment they call the Autism Intervention Research Network on Physical Health. But it's really a co-network that was built on the backbone of the Autism Treatment Network. Okay? To date, HRSA has spent $3 for every dollar Autism Speaks has spent on the network. This is a way to leverage the dollars that we raise so that we learn more and more and more about the health and well-being and treatment of individuals with autism. The network, this co-network, does some amazing work that's really practical. For example, they study things like obesity in people with autism. It turns out that people with autism have higher rates of obesity. They study things like the fact that many, many people with autism who have challenging behavior, aggression, self-injury, elopement, are actually, unfortunately, not getting appropriate behavioral assessments and interventions first. Many of these people, unfortunately, get antipsychotics first. We know that antipsychotics are oftentimes a useful treatment, but they shouldn't be used before we get an appropriate behavioral assessment in place, right? This kind of information is important because we want to make sure that providers are aware that this is happening so that we can decrease how much this happens for people with autism. Now, this is the current Autism Treatment Network. It's not very geographically or demographically representative. And one of our goals over the next few years is to try to make it more geographically and demographically representative. Now, this is not literal, but it's meant to represent the idea that if you have a distributed network, that you can do these kinds of clinical trials, you can do this kind of work, and at the same time you do that, you can disseminate best practices out into the communities. And this is happening in a small way already. There's a program through the Autism Treatment Network and the ARP network called Echo Autism. And what Echo Autism does is it uses a telemedicine platform. Pediatricians who may not know much at all about autism can sign up, and they can become part of this platform, and they actually learn through telemedicine how to better screen for, diagnose, and manage patients with autism within their practice. Many of these people are in rural areas. It started actually in Missouri, so many of these people are in rural areas of Missouri. And because of this, they've trained or had involved in the program more than 600 pediatricians. This is a way to take best practices and move them out into the community. Another way we leverage the dollars is through public health. And Dr. Andy Shear, who is based here right around the corner at our headquarter office, is fantastic at going to countries and saying, you could do more for your populations with autism. In fact, he's developed a program that they call the caregiver, used to be called parent skills training. I have to update this slide, caregiver skills training program. And what it does is it teaches caregivers, like I said before, early intervention strategies for individuals with autism. Andy has been able to get 30 countries to adopt this program or programs like it for their populations of individuals with autism. This allows us to leverage your dollar so that countries are investing in helping individuals with autism. He's done this in Asia, Africa, Southeast Asia, Africa, China. He has Eastern Europe, countries in Eastern Europe that have been involved. So really fantastic work that he's done all over the world. And as I mentioned, our research fellowships, we have over 100 research fellowships that we've supported, including 72 predoctoral fellows. These folks are becoming the leaders. I can give you examples. There's a model called the maternal immune activation model. We know that if moms have an activated immune system, there's an increased likelihood that they'll have a child with autism. It's not a huge increase, but it's an increase. And one of our predoctoral fellows has been working on this model and actually has done some of the pioneering work in this area. We've had other fellows doing just amazing work in all kinds of other areas, including things like taking interventions and scaling them for school systems in California so that they can do much better interventions within schools for people with autism. So a lot of really practical but also groundbreaking kinds of basic science work. And I just want to finish up, and then we'll get to questions. I promised you questions. I want to finish up and just let you know what we're planning for the remainder of this year and then for the next 2 years. We developed a strategic plan midway through last year, sort of towards the end of 2017, and we started enacting it in 2018. And one of the things I'm really proud of is we went out and we asked people in our network to tell us what are the kinds of areas of research and science that you think are really crucial. And we had the survey open for almost 2 months, but almost within just like a 2-week period, we got almost 6,000 people responding to the survey. That shows you how engaged the community is, that they're just eager to tell us about what it is that they think we should be doing. We had almost 500 people with autism respond, which I'm really proud of, and 4,400 family members, as you can guess, many of these were moms, and also had researchers and clinicians and educators that responded. And I'm not going to show you all the data. It's actually published in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. But I just want to show you one piece of data from this survey. We asked people, what should be the mission of Autism Speaks Science? And on the far left is to discover the causes of autism. The next one is to increase our understanding of the biology of autism. The next one is to improve our ability to screen, identify, and track autism throughout the lifespan. And the last one is about evaluating and improving interventions for autism and related challenges and conditions. And I was absolutely certain when we asked this that the bars on the far right would be very high. People, of course, want interventions and supports. But what I was so impressed with our community is that how high the bars on the left were also. That people recognize that, yes, we need better interventions and supports now. But at the same time, we also need to continue to understand biology and understand causes so that we can help personalize interventions and supports in the future. And so this was really impressive to me. I think it shows you how educated our community is and how passionate our community is. And so what we did was we decided as a science program, and we have these wonderful medical and science advisory committee members who are all over the country that come into New York City for our meetings, and they advise us. But when they saw the data, they felt the same way that I felt, which was we really need to take 2 paths in our science program. The first path is to continue down the path of personalized therapeutic discovery, meaning personalized medicine. We know this is working in other areas. For at least a decade, it's been going on in cancer research. I think people are aware of that. We don't talk about breast cancer anymore. We talk about different forms of breast cancer. Triple negative, you get genetic testing to figure out if you have a certain form because it dictates the treatment that you get, right? Same thing with lung cancer. They talk about RAS-associated lung cancer, right? This is personalized medicine. But there are some other examples as well now. Another one is spinal muscular atrophy. Have you heard of spinal muscular atrophy? It's a neurodevelopmental condition. They've just had a medicine approved called Spinraza, and actually it's quite useful. It appears to be quite useful for individuals with this condition. And then the Foundation Fighting Blindness was working on a gene therapy for many years, and they just were approved for a gene therapy for a particular form of congenital blindness. So personalized medicine is here. Okay, it's here today. And there's no reason why, even though autism is different than these other conditions, there's no reason why we also shouldn't be trying to personalize interventions and supports, because we know autism is so different across individuals. And so we're going to continue down this path, and in fact, we already have the programs to help us continue down this path. At the same time, we know that people and families with autism need better help, better care, better interventions, better supports now. And so we're going to focus some of our research on near-term solutions. And that's going to include things like better treatments. We just offered a clinical trials request for applications. We're going to fund 2 clinical trials starting next year. We're also funding a 3rd clinical trial through our Autism Treatment Network. We're hoping to be able to identify best practices in adult transition and evidence-based practices through funding research in adult transition. So we're going to do all kinds of things. This slide lists some other areas that we hope to be able to make an impact on as well. These are the 5 strategic areas. You can find this online. It's on our website and under our science strategic plan. I'm not going to go through it, but just to say, to add another piece besides personalized medicine and near-term solutions, we also are going to try to focus on improving measurement of autism. And the reason why we think this is important is it'll help us to identify individuals earlier through screening and diagnosis, but it'll also help us to track symptom and behavior change and cognitive change and neurological change over time so we can better understand autism. It'll also mean that clinical trials will be more effective, because one of the reasons why clinical trials so far in autism have not been very effective is that we think we haven't done a very good job of actually measuring change in these trials. Okay? So that's going to be another focus. And then the last focus I'll mention is our thought leader. As Autism Speaks, one of our roles is to bring people together, thought leaders, together to be able to understand particular areas of science better. So we've done one of these already. In September here in New York City, we did an evidence-based practice conference. The idea behind this was we wanted to understand what are the best ways we can get information about evidence-based practices out to the community so that people are using their time, their energy, their effort, their money more wisely and effectively. And then the next one we're doing is going to be about cannabis research, because we know families are trying cannabis, and we want to make sure that we're pushing the research forward so that families can make much more educated decisions about the use of cannabis or cannabis-related products. So I'm going to thank you for your attention. Everyone was very, very punctual and attentive. This is amazing.